Let me share maybe with you something about the background which led to this book, because living in Palestine for the last 26 years as pastor, I could see lots of disconnect. As pastor, I was often speaking at theological seminaries like Yale, on the one hand, but then I was very much engaged also with political scientists and political activists and so on. And I felt a bit schizophrenic, because dealing with theologians, for them history starts more or less with Abraham and ends more or less with the second Jewish revolt, 132 to 135. They don't bother to think about what comes after that. Now, when I was moving among politicians and political scientists, for them history will start late 19th century with the Zionist movement and goes all the way until Kerry and the peace talks. So they don't bother to go earlier, and the theologians, they don't bother to think about what's going on today. It's a bit schizophrenic. And somehow I just couldn't buy this. I said, there is something wrong here. And this was actually the first disconnect I was able to see, because as a Palestinian, the history of my country doesn't start with Abraham. It starts before. And it doesn't stop with the second Jewish revolt, but it goes on. And so that was, the first thing. The second thing that was bothering me is that I could feel, a bias against us as Palestinians in the theological discourse, but also in many other places. And that was bothering me also a lot. Because I think if you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if it were just a conflict between Israeli and Palestinians, I tell you, we would have solved it long, long time ago. The problem is that the international community is part of the problem, not part of the solution. They would love to see themselves part of the solution, but actually they have been so far part of the problem. And in two ways part of the problem. On the one hand, the international community, mainly the Western countries, were providing Israel with the hardware. And actually this hardware made the occupation continue, because the Israeli didn't need to pay it from their own pocket, the price of the occupation. And so all of these toys, the F-16 and the submarines and so on, Israel were getting that as Christmas gifts all the time. But on the other hand, and I think that's even more dangerous, I could see that seminaries, theological seminaries, and theologians were providing the software for this hardware to operate. That's very dangerous. What do I mean with the software? The software meaning that an average American Christian in the pew on Sunday morning, when he hears something from the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and he hears the word Israel, and then he goes back home and watch Fox News, say, many of them do that, somehow, subconsciously, they connect biblical Israel with the modern state of Israel, which really leads to a bias against us as Palestinians, and that is part of the problem. So that was the other thing which was bothering me a lot. And the third thing is that I felt that when it comes really to dialogue, our narrative is not something that people are familiar with. You know, an average American is very much familiar with the Jewish narrative, with the Jewish story, with the Jewish suffering, with this. But when it comes to the Palestinians, our story is not only not known, often, unfortunately, it's silenced. A good example, you know, yesterday at Boston University, I was invited there to speak to the graduate school. And it's interesting, one Jewish professor, he really worked hard to make sure that I will not be invited. Because he didn't want really this other narrative to be heard. There should be a monopoly over narrative. I think it's high time to break this monopoly. Because you have to hear both narratives, and then you can decide, and don't mind how you decide, but it's very important to take both people seriously. And so this book actually wants exactly to contribute to challenge these disconnects we live with all the time. Now, thanks God, in the last 30 years, there have been some very positive developments happening that I mentioned in the second chapter of the book. And it's all started, interestingly enough, it's all started with a Palestinian, Arab, Christian, and a Protestant thinker at Columbia University. Edward Said, as a Palestinian Christian born in Jerusalem, had to go to exile. Sounds very biblical. And in exile, he came to feel this bias I was talking about. And this is when he wrote, actually, 1978, his book on Orientalism. So he could actually depict this bias against Arabs, Muslims. Didn't talk much about Palestinians, but about Arabs and Muslims, about the whole region. So it started with him, and following him and others, there was a good development of what they call post-colonial theologies, looking at theologically differently and with the lens of post-colonialism. And after that, actually, after the Iraq War, 2003, there was so many books written about the empire. They were mainly actually American theologians and thinkers who were not happy with the way the U.S. dealt with the whole war on Iraq. And they were afraid that these might be symptoms of an empire. And so they were talking about it. And so I'm using that also as part of this development. And last but not least, in the last 5 years, there is a very interesting project that started in Norway called Jesus and Cultural Complexity. Very interesting research project that actually challenges lots of the assumptions that we have. So with all of this development, I felt, you know, I'm not sane with what I'm writing. But it is, if you read it, and I encourage you to read it, if you read it, you will realize this is theology upside down. This is not how we used to look at things. And I think this is really what is exciting in the book. It's not, you know, things that we have been writing in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. So if you are looking for that, don't buy the book. But if you are really looking for a new perspective that will challenge your own perspective right now, if you are looking for something new, I think this book really, all the reviews so far, and it got actually a starred review in the weekly review. and people working with library, they know the weekly review very well. For me, all of them actually agree that there is here a new lens introduced. So for me, that's the most important thing. So the new lens, and I come to that, Green said this is my 16th book, which is true. But with all the last 15 books, I felt I was dancing to the rhythm of 19th century European organ music. I like it, but, you know, this is not how our bodies work. With this book, I feel finally I was able to take the beat of the Palestinian drum. And people who are acquainted with Palestinian music, they know the drum is the main instrument. Because it's that beat that actually gives the whole energy and the whole rhythm. So here I felt, you know, finally I was able to put aside the German lens. I was trained in Germany. And, you know, if you were trained in Germany like me 30 years ago, imagine I never ever took any course in contextual theology. Why? Because Germans were looking down on contextual theologians. And, you know, it's as if Germans were doing theology, the main thing, and people in subtropical countries were doing contextual theology. They wouldn't really believe that German theology is very contextual. And there isn't any contextless theology, because every theology is, at the end of the day, is contextual. So with this book, I feel finally I'm home. Finally, I'm trying really not to deal with all the German sensitivities they have, you know, towards the Jews and towards their history and towards this and towards that. In this book, finally, I'm saying this is our narrative. Take it or leave it, but you have to hear it. So I feel we stop just reacting, because before, you know, oh, here we have Christian Zionists, we have to react to that. There we have this, we have to react to that. Somebody in this seminary says this, we have to react to that. Here I'm saying, you know, leave all of this. We don't want to react, we want to act. And let others react. So in this book, basically, I'm saying this is our narrative. For me, if you look at the history of Palestine, one major factor in our history was that we were almost all the time living under imperial occupation. I had a Presbyterian pastor, a very good friend. He said, you know, I would like to come with my church to visit the Holy Land. But, you know, we are a bit afraid, so we are waiting for peace to come. I said, you are telling me you are not coming. Because, I mean, if you look at history for the last, I'm not sure what, you know, it all started with the Assyrians, 722 BC. Then we had the Babylonians, 587. Then we had the Persians, 538. Then we had the Greek. Then we had the Roman. And usually with theologians, they stop with the Romans, as if that was the last empire that was there. But for us, history continues, because after the Romans came the Byzantines. And Byzantines, you know, they forced actually most of the Christians to become Greek Orthodox. So if you look at my name, Mitri, it's not an Arabic name. It's not a Lutheran name, because Mitri is a saint in the Greek Orthodox Church. And my great-grandfather, his name is Constantine, which really talks about that empire. So you see, even in my name, traces of the empire. While most probably my forefathers were Aramaic-speaking Christians who were not Orthodox, not kosher, in that sense, and were forced to become Hellenized and Greek Orthodox. So, Byzantines, then came the Arabs, then the Crusaders, then a few other groups, and then the Ottomans, and then the British, and then, believe it or not, Israel. Now, this is not how we are used to look at history, because we usually connect Israel with biblical Israel and not connect it with the empire. But if you ask any political scientist, he will tell you Israel is part of European colonial history. Forget about everything else, but that's fact. So if you look at it, you understand actually what the occupation is all about. It's just one other piece in this long, series of continuous occupation. And suddenly, you understand actually that the Palestinians of today and the Israelites of the Bible, they share the same destiny. And so if you really want to understand how the Jewish people in the Hebrew Bible must have felt under Assyrian, under Babylonian, under Roman, you have to listen today to the Palestinians, because they are echoing the same experience after 2,000 years. So now this is upside down what I'm saying, So we are really not used to look at things this way. But I think that's the exciting thing. And so if you live like me under Israeli occupation and, you see all of this happening, there was a time when I felt maybe during my lifetime, I will experience peace. Maybe during Oslo at the beginning. Now I'm sure I'm like Moses, will not see the promised land. So the question, will my daughter, who is sitting there, will she be able to enter the promised land? Or will this just continue forever? Now, so if you look at this, you will understand actually, in order to understand the Bible, we don't start in heaven. Most of the theologians, they start in heaven. So everything they are saying actually is totally irrelevant sorry to say it, but. So in this book, I'm saying actually we start with geopolitics. I think it's the only book in theology that starts with the geopolitics. The geopolitics meaning, this little tiny country of Palestine with so limited resources, so small, surrounded by all of these regional powers. And Palestine have been always in the magnetic fields of these powers. It was very difficult to survive. So that geopolitical setting of Palestine actually was the trigger for the Bible. So that's very important. So for me, the whole Bible is nothing but a response, an answer to the geopolitical reality. So within that geopolitical reality, if you live always under the heat of the empire, and you are burned by the heat of the empire, you start asking questions like, where are you, God? Where are you? And you go to an Israeli checkpoint, you see an old Palestinian woman humiliated by a young Israeli soldier, and she would, look at heaven and shout in Arabic, "Wenak ya Allah, where are you, God?" Now, this question, echoes throughout the Bible, where are you, God? Because if you live in Palestine, God seems to be so silent. He sees all of these empires, and he does nothing against it. He seems to be just sitting there, watching his people, being sent to exile. He seems to be so, so just, so not doing anything when Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is burned down. Nothing. And this is why I think in the New Testament, the climax of Revelation is on the cross. Because that is the actual revelation. Revelation was not that there is a God. That's totally boring. And not that there is one God. Boring. Totally irrelevant. The revelation that our forefathers and mothers were able to do, this is what we call revelation. Their discovery is that they were able to spot God where no one else was able to spot God. When everything seems to be over, when everything seems to be destroyed, lost, when Jesus on the cross is saying, my God, why did you forsake me? Basically, where are you, God? It's exactly there where revelation happens, which is really of very important, of great importance, because then actually no defeat is really a defeat. So you don't give the empire one day to be happy about their victory, because their victory loses its teeth if God revealed himself on the cross. And this is where, when I was thinking of a cover for the book, I chose this cover, which was actually painted by one of the 3 top Palestinian artists, who happens to be a Muslim. This painting was done 2002, when we were under curfew. Israel invaded Bethlehem, and for 40 days we were under 24/7 curfew. And we said what to do. I have written at that time one of my books, these 40 days. But we sent out a competition among our teachers and students saying, we need you to think of a painting that you would like to paint about Christ in the Palestinian context. It's very interesting. All Muslim painters had Jesus on the cross. You think it's against their dogma, it's against their theology, but when they think of Palestine and what is the identity of Palestine, they don't think of anything else but the cross. And so this is why I chose actually this picture, because I think that's really the revelation that came out of Palestine. But the last chapter, and I will end here, in the last chapter I talk about imagination and hope, because I think that the Bible the whole time struggle with this issue. Can we think of the unthinkable? Or are we just damned for life and eternity to live under imperial rule? Is occupation going to continue on and on and on and on, and there is no end of this? And I think it's very important that in the Bible there is this prophetic imagination, that we can imagine actually something new that was not there at all. It wasn't there in our history. But something new can happen. It's the new Jerusalem. It's the new heaven and the new earth. Something totally unthinkable, something different than what we have known. And I think this is why when Jesus was going, traveling throughout Palestine, he had only one topic. He was proclaiming what? The kingdom of God. We cannot understand what the kingdom is unless we understand what the empire is. Because the kingdom actually is the new reality that is much bigger and much more powerful than the most powerful empire. And so if we really want to understand what Jesus was saying, we have really to start with geopolitics and with imperial rule, which again continues until today. So in that sense, hope becomes not something we see coming at us, but hope becomes how can we feel invited, feel empowered, become proactive in making sure that the kingdom will not be just a theological term, but that people in Palestine, people oppressed, will get a foretaste of what this kingdom is all about. A kingdom where there is equality, where there is freedom, and where actually there will be new music coming out of Palestine. So I will stop here, and this is just to give you a foretaste of the book. The full taste, you have to read it. So thank you.